Well, I think I'll start. Today's saint is Saint Teresa of Avila, who died on October 15th in 1582. She was part of the Counter-Reformation response to the Reformation, where the Catholic Church tried to get things in order. And she reformed the Carmelite nunneries, the nuns, and she also reformed the male version of the Carmelites. So she was quite a figure as part of a reformer. But she's most famous for her mystic writing. She had many mystical experiences, and she wrote about those mystical experiences. But she still had a very practical side to her, where she tried to deal with practical problems with people. And she wrote about themes such as comfort and sorrow, worry, how these things affect us and how to deal with them. When she died, and this is what I want to focus on, when she died, an old handmade bookmark was found in her prayer book, which she used and took wherever she went. On the bookmark, Teresa had written, and here's our prayer for the day: "Let nothing disturb you, let nothing make you afraid. All things are passing. God alone never changes. Patience gains all things. If you are God, you will want nothing. God alone suffices." Amen. Saint Teresa. Well, first of all, I want to give a thanks to all the folks that worked so hard last week, where we had all those goods lined up, and the group took them down to Boone, and I just had a little bit of a report on that, but we appreciate very much the efforts that are made by all these folks, and he tells me you're going to go down again.
We're going to go back to another one.
So many thanks
November 16th.
to those who bore the burden of taking that material down. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about the distinction between direct and indirect ways that the church, the religious tradition, affects not only culture but politics. And the indirect ways I broke down into kind of intentional, unintentional, and intentional. Unintentional is where the church is really a powerful forming agent, forms its lay people so that they have what some people call the worldview, or I like to call a Christian vision, that's comprehensive, tries to make sense of everything, that addresses the central questions of life, and for us is unsurpassable, forms people so much in that vision and the moral tradition that goes with it, that they move into culture and affect culture dramatically by acting out their Christian convictions. And that affects politics big time. And generally this is unintentional by the church. It's just, the church is a great forming agent. But sometimes it's intentional, where the church, like we're doing, talks about these things and stimulates the laity to think about these things and to move forward into their callings, but also into political life. So this week, I always look up First Things, one of my favorite websites, and when they try to get you to contribute something, they often offer a book. If you contribute so much money, you've run across that one. But what really caught my eye was the book that you could get free if you contributed so much. And it was by a Catholic archbishop by the name of Chaput, C-H-A-P-U-T. I think I'm saying that right. An Orthodox Catholic archbishop. And now, these days, you have to make a distinction between which Catholic bishops are Orthodox and which aren't, kind of like Protestantism is falling into it. Anyway, he's an Orthodox archbishop and wrote a book that was offered called "Render unto Caesar, Serving Our Nation by Living Our Catholic Beliefs in Political Life." Now, how about that? Or encouragement by the church to live out your beliefs in political life. So that's a very self-conscious, indirect way that the church affects political life. So I noted that. Last week we talked about one of the bad ways to relate religion and politics, a living religious tradition with the political and cultural sphere, and that was the separationist. where you separate religion from politics. And the first one that we spent the most time on probably was now the cultural left in this country trying to shut down Christian expression in political life. And even more dangerously, to shut off Christian expression in public cultural life. And I look around across a couple of examples of that this week. Remember the baker from Colorado, who they went after when he wouldn't bake a cake celebrating a homosexual union. Well, they went back to him. They got that dismissed with a lot of legal fees. And the second time they went back to him because they wanted to bake a cake. This is all provocative, of course. Bake a cake for somebody who had just transitioned from male to female, and he refused to do that. Broke his, violated his Christian beliefs. But now they were after him a third time. This time, they wanted to bake a cake with Satan smoking a reefer. Getting pretty bad, right? Anyway, the Colorado Supreme Court dismissed that. It didn't have to go anything higher than that. But example of the pressures being put on people expressing their Christianity and their callings. And I'm told now that in Canada, that if you're going to be a doctor, you must participate in the training for abortion. And if you don't, you are dismissed. You can't go further. And people are worried about that happening in the United States. I don't think it's happened yet. But that's the kind of pressure that separates a religious tradition from public life and political life. And fairly strong, and a lot of kickback now. Don't know how it's going to turn out. The other kind of separation of religion and politics was from the first time keeping dangerous religion out of political life. And I call it selective separation because it's conservative religious people that they don't want in political life. Liberal Christians are given a free pass because they agree with the secular agenda that's happening. So it's the conservative religious people that are not only hunted out in their private or their callings, but also in public political life. The other kind was from the religious side, not avoiding politics. And there's the classic sectarian tradition of the Amish and people who believe any involvement in political life is coercive and therefore against Jesus' commandments. So they live a life separate from political life and some cultural life, including some neo-sectarians like Stanley Hauerwas, who our pastor went to Duke to train under, but didn't take any courses, right? Anyway, you wouldn't have agreed with a lot what he said anyway. But then other kinds of separation of politics from religious life, or religious life from politics, just the plain old separation of Sunday from Monday that many Christians do. They don't exercise their Christian values and outlook in political life. They operate on self-interest. What's in it for me? But we're called to do more than self-interest. And we'll talk about that next week when I give the right way to relate religion and politics. Because today we're going to move on the fusion of religion and politics. But so last week we did that, the separation of religion and politics. So I don't want to get into any more detail about reviewing that. I want to move on now to a second bad way to relate religion and politics, and that's to fuse them. And with a little introduction, I wanted to talk about the Lutheran distinction between two ways that God reigns in the world. The horizontal level of history with his left hand maintaining as much order and justice as you can through the various orders of creation, marriage and family life, work, citizenship, and church, all orders of creation which God uses to sustain the creation. But none of those are redemptive on that horizontal line, particularly not politics. Politics has a very modest a great challenge to maintain order and justice. That's before humans, coram hominibus, before humans. Then there's the vertical dimension where we're before God. And that's a very different dimension because we're totally receptive on that dimension. We don't work our ways up. That was what Luther's criticism of the Catholic Church in his day. There was a way to work your way up. He thought, in a very pure way, that God comes down in Christ. The Holy Spirit opens our heart. We receive the grace of God in Christ, which is a pure gift with which we do nothing. It's a gift. And it's God's work through Christ to us. And that is sharply distinguished from what happens on this level, but they're not separated, because it's in the Christian callings and in the work of the church that there's an intersection between the vertical and the horizontal. But one has to be very careful not to accumulate political work with the work of the gospel. Because if you start doing that, you start getting into mixing the gospel with what we can do politically. And then you tend to religionize politics or politicize religion when you start fusing the two. So I want to start with that, or with kind of a distinction that's very important. Because when we start fusing, we violate the radicalness and the universality of the gospel. The radicalness is that we don't do it. God does it in Christ and saves us through Christ's work in the Holy Spirit. We're receptive. So that's the radicality of the gospel. The universality of the gospel is that it goes to every sinner alive, regardless of various political divisions that we're in. And even some of the divisions that were horrendous, war divisions of war. Joanne and I had the great blessing of being Fulbright scholars in the late 50s, when many of the Second World War people were still around. And we were kind of taken in by a couple of German families. One, their daughter just come to America to marry an American, and they were without kids, so they adopted us. It was really wonderful. But him and his dear friend were both veterans of the German army, and they were wonderful Christians. But yet, they were in the machine, the Nazi machine, that was fighting our boys and creating lots of havoc in the world, and kind of the muscle that allowed the near annihilation of the Jews. So they had quite a heavy burden, and they didn't talk about it. They had a hard time getting to talk about it. But they also are receivers of the gospel as repenting people. Yeah.
There was a professor at Plymouth College when my parents were there that was in the same situation.
Oh, really?
It was Dr. Beck. I don't know if you, I think he was in the psychology department, but he had fought in World War II. He's German, and he fought for the German army, but he worked as a medic. So, but it's interesting to think about that and wonder if the same thing had happened in today, if he would even be able to be hired.
Well, do you remember Professor Snow? No, he retired at the time you went through. He had just retired when I got there, and he was a German, Austrian, and his past was very murky because he came from South America to come up to teach the work. But he was a good Christian fellow. So the point I'm illustrating is that the gospel is universal and doesn't recognize these divisions that are so important for us in our political life.
Did either of those men regret what they had done, or did they still see it as justified?
No, they were very regretful.
They were.
They were regretful about it, and they were so embarrassed about it that they didn't want to talk about it. And it was only toward the end of his life that Walter Horn talked about how painful it was to be drafted. And if you weren't drafted, you wound up in a prison or shot.
Yeah.
So it took very, very brave souls to resist what the Nazis were doing. And these guys weren't that brave, and they were very embarrassed about that. And I once asked them about a Nazi song, Horst Basil's song.
Yeah.
And I said, do you guys know that? They wouldn't sing it. They wouldn't know it. So they were quite uneasy and embarrassed about it. But the point I'm making is we have all these divisions in life, and the gospel doesn't recognize those. It's repentant sinners no matter what side of the political divisions of life. So in the coming election, one of my kids is not a demon because they're gonna vote for Kamala Harris. So they're still a Christian even though they might vote differently than I do. Anyway, that's, what I will get into in the first part of the handout is a lot of examples of fusion, where history is replete with all sorts of fusions, where you intertwine religion and politics, culture, so much that transcendence is lost, and those outside are condemned, and those inside are saved and righteous. And I even think of some of the Old Testament gatherings in which you get the close correlation between the religion of Israel and the politics, and how the prophets kept going after that, always criticizing that sharply, not only the wandering away from Judaism, but how the politics and the religion were fused. And it seems like when the world was young, that was a very common way that ancient people did it. They fused it all together. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer makes a wonderful distinction. He's reflecting about what was happening, and he said, the world has come of age. The world was young at one time, and when you had these coalitions of politics and religion, but from the Enlightenment onward, and particularly from the American founding, you get the observation of religious freedom, where religion is not coerced, but it's free. So Bonhoeffer says when the world comes of age, we have to respect human freedom much more than it did earlier in the age. So I give some examples. Even the Holy Roman Empire, what the Catholics did with the early church, of course, was not fused with politics. It was the object of a lot of discrimination and oppression. But finally, Constantine got religion, remember? In 300, and he begins coercing people to become Christians, but he also sends missionaries who are not coercive. So it's a mixed bag. But gradually, they build up to a huge fusion of Christianity and politics. And remember in the first session when I talked about Christ above culture, the pyramid, where you have God in the heavens, Christ is his son, and the vicar of Christ on earth is the Pope. Then you have the orders at the top level, and at the bottom level you have politics, economics, art, all shaped and dictated in some sense by the Catholic Church. There wasn't any secular law, there was canon law. And even the economics at the time were shaped by Catholic teachings. And it got fused with feudalism. So when capitalism comes along, a lot of Catholic countries don't get in line. So you get countries that were deeply Catholic, like Portugal and Spain, who were very reluctant to take up capitalism and suffered from kind of poverty long into the times that the more Protestant countries didn't. So you get, while I have great admiration for that, thousands of years in which Christians built Christendom, there was a lot of fusion there that finally Luther rang the bell on. He thought the fusion of the political princes and kings and so on, and with the purported church being the master of that was corrupting the church to claim the secular sword as well as the spiritual sword. So Luther shook up the kind of fusion that Christendom had created in that era. But then, in a way, all heck breaks loose because you get the breakup of Christendom into various confessional groups, and they start fighting each other. And there's a fusion between, say, the Swedes and Lutheranism, and they go fight the Catholics and the Austrians, and they kill each other. Very grim chapter in Christian history. And finally, the Enlightenment comes along and says, let's keep confessional Christianity out of the politics. Let's privatize it and try to keep people together without killing each other on the basis of fused religion and politics. So there's a long history of fusion that I think the Reformation in one way was trying to get clear of, that the gospel is freed from these political arrangements and the cultural arrangements that was part of Catholic Christendom. So Luther frees the gospel in a way that it hadn't been free before, as well as criticizing and reforming the way the gospel was presented as more of a process of works up to heaven rather than receiving the gospel from above. So there was a great deal of shakeup in the Reformation, and as I give further examples where you get fusions,
Bob, could
I'm
I
going to
add
talk
one?
about the wars of religion. Yeah,
Could I add one thing to that? You see, Luther freed up the gospel
yeah,
to let the church be the church, but he also really freed up the world to be the world in a good way. You know, to say, if you're a prince, you're there by God's appointment. You know, it's not like you really should be a monk. You know, if you were a real Christian, you'd leave and become a monk. No, it's God wants you to be a prince. Look, David was a godly prince. Be like David, or a housewife, or a carpenter, or whatever. Okay? Saying that these are actually noble things, and I just want to add that in too, Bob.
well, and the church under Luther was secularized, not the way you talked about it. It was secularized in the sense that it was no longer under the control of the church. And canon law was abolished and secular law was, but all of that was influenced by the theologians who had conversations with the magistrates. So it wasn't it was a version of Christendom, but it was gentler Christendom. Everything was on a horizontal level. The orders of creation were on a horizontal level where they interacted, but they weren't on the hierarchical level, which tended to fuse things. So anyway, that's a little bit further elaboration of the Reformation. I talk about state churches, where you had the Scandinavian state churches, where earlier on they were pretty repressive. Evangelical groups, Pentecostal groups that were state church were run out of, either imprisoned or they were run out of the Scandinavian countries. They came to America and developed their own spirituality, somewhat Pentecostal, of a Scandinavian sort. But then as things secularized, like in Iceland, you no longer are punished for not being part of the Lutheran Church. In fact, the Lutheran Church is pretty well disregarded. Where the Catholics were stronger in countries where the church shaped the culture and the politics more dramatically, like Ireland and Quebec, boy, when secularization comes, there's a huge revulsion against Catholicism. So you had this horrible secular movement now in Ireland. They just had a big debate whether you could use mother and father in the Constitution of Ireland. They wanted to wipe it out, you know, the gender ideology people, but they found a hairline vote that kept it in. So there's a huge revulsion, very, very close, huge revulsion against the fusion because so many people are excluded or they're put down. So we have vestiges that Quebec evidently now is highly secular after once being dominated by Catholic culture and the Catholic hierarchy. So anyway, I think we should appreciate even more the founders of our country, who were quite aware of the dangers of fusion of religion and politics in the state churches that they knew. And they knew that kind of corrupted religion and squelched religion because it didn't allow spontaneity and creativity in religion. So they didn't want state churches. They allowed some states to have state churches, but that finally ended about 1833, I think, with Massachusetts. But anyway, they knew that if you didn't have state church, you had to have vital religion in order to have citizens of virtue. So they encouraged, all the founders said, virtue is important for our republic. Without virtue, the republic will fall apart. We can't have limited government without citizens of virtue. So the founders said we got to have strong religion so that'll produce citizens of virtue. So I think they're brilliant and avoided the kind of fusion that was so much part of history before that fusion of religion and politics. I talk about some political use of religion, some of it cynical and very real. Think of what Hitler did with the Lutheran Church in Germany. He tried to co-opt it and get it to buy into Nazi ideology, which it did. And a couple of really major theologians, Lutheran theologians, bit the bait and hopped on the Hitler bandwagon. I had one of them in Erlangen as a professor called Althaus. And after the war, they had to go through denazification because they were under such suspicion for having opted with the Nazis early on in the Nazi movement. By the time that it was happening, the Nazis were doing in the late 30s, they got off the Nazi book. It was too late. Their reputation had already been damaged very badly. But Hitler co-opted, fused German Lutheranism with Nazism. What a horrible thing. And Bonhoeffer sniffed that out very early. And the confessing church, brave souls, were willing to fight against that fusion, which was a horrific fusion, which the Lutherans in Germany had a long period of repentance about that particular fusion. Think of what Stalin did with Russian Orthodoxy. You know, when the Bolsheviks came into power, they murdered hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Orthodox priests. They tried to annihilate the Orthodox Church because it had been fused with Tsarism. It had been fused so tightly. And so when they thought the revolution was going to come, first thing they had to do was destroy the fusion, and that meant destroying the church. So they were murderous in relation to the Orthodox Church, but they were also murderous in relation to the Jews. I didn't know that chapter of the Bolshevik Revolution. They put to death thousands and thousands of Jews also. Anyway, when the Germans start knocking the door of Stalingrad, all of a sudden Stalin gets religion. And he puffs up the Orthodox Church and tries to get the Orthodox Church to regenerate patriotism and energy on the part of the defeated Russian masses. So he then co-opts Orthodoxy and fuses again, tries to fuse kind of a phony fusion of Orthodoxy and politics, the Bolshevik Revolution. Much more recently, you remember reading about the Patriarch of Russia blessing the war in Ukraine, blessing that on the part of the Orthodox Church, and praising Putin for restoring the Russian Empire, trying to restore the horrible kind of shivering fusion of Russian Orthodoxy and politics. I even get a little brave and talk about American politicians a little bit. I better be careful here. Trump has a Bible that he's selling for a big price, and one wonders if that's too wise to put your name on the Bible. And inside it's all about the Constitution and other things. But more vividly, remember in the big riots of 2020 or whatever, and the church across the street is burning. There's a Episcopal church is burning, and he carries a Bible across the street as kind of a beacon of Christian piety, saving the church. I don't know. But anyway, I'll be skeptical about that. Is that a use of religion? And then, of course, Biden bothers me very much. He has his prayer beads and claims to be a serious Christian, where politically he does everything he can against Catholic teachings, abortion, the gender thing, the whole thing. He's full-blown politically against the church that he claims to be a part of. So there's a good deal of fusion. I probably shouldn't go into all these examples. Before the fall of the Soviet Union, in about 1989, 1990, there was a great flurry of activity in trying to put together Christian theology and Marxism. And it happened in Eastern Europe. A lot of people were saying they're compatible and they can be fused. This is intellectual fusion. And liberation theology in Latin America was a fusion of Marxist thinking and Christian theology. which you have to do a lot of damage to Christian theology, the radicality and the universality, you have to damage that pretty badly to fuse Marxism and Christianity. But that was a great fad, and probably it was more serious than that. And you had many examples of that. Kind of waned after the Soviet Union collapsed. But there was a famous, infamous woman by the name of Dorothy Sola. Do you know that name, Phil? A little before your time.
I know the name.
She was a radical feminist Marxist who was fusing Christianity and Marxism, and a rabble-rouser. She had quite a following among the political left trying to fuse Marxism and Christianity. And she was invited to speak at the seminary at which I taught. And she gave her rousing speech of collapsing, fusing the two. And in the question and answer period, I had the guts to ask this question. And I asked Professor Sola, my father's a Republican, can he be saved? She didn't like the question. Stammered and sputtered around, but that's exactly what it was doing. It was taking any kind of conservatives and putting them in the realm of hell. Paul Tillich, famous Paul Tillich, wrote a book in which he said, a Christian can't be anything but a socialist. That kind of fusion is embarrassing too, yeah.
Isn't that where Pope Francis is? I mean, that's a lot of Pope Francis's.
Well, he flirted, I think, with liberation theology, but he's kind of an opponent of capitalism, partly as kind of that flavor that he got from South American liberation theology, but certainly he can't be a full-blown Marxist, couldn't be fusion that. He would be in more trouble than he is in. Right.
Even though Marxism and socialism maybe starts out pure as a fusion, don't they eventually have to push down the belief that of God-given rights in order for the central government to push the socialists or communists?
Well, probably in the West they would try to do that. It would be pretty phony.
Any large government, I would think, would have to push down this idea that there's some higher power than ours that are given to govern rights that we.
Well, what did the Soviets do? The Soviets did, they were the harbinger of a classless society, of the heaven coming to earth.
Right.
Hadn't happened yet, but they claimed that authority for the future society that
That's
they're
my
building.
point.
So there's some way to claim transcendent authority, you're right, but it may not be God.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's
Okay, well, I got into a lot of other reflection. We can support our nation without fusing our faith with our politics. And I use the example of C.S. Lewis during the Second World War. You know when he wrote Mere Christianity? You know that story? The Germans were bombing all over England, and the morale of the people were really down. And the government asked C.S. Lewis to give talks every week on the Christian faith. So he took topics every week and gave these brilliant radio talks, there wasn't TV, that became Mere Christianity. And is that fusing Christianity with Western British civilization politics over against the Nazis? I would say we have to make judicious decisions without fusing them, but saying there are certainly causes that we as Christians want to support without fusing things, without making too much of them in terms of denying the radicality and universality of the gospel. I talked about Second World War and the great support of the Americans and the Allies by the churches. I'm old enough to remember the ending of the war, standing on the porch and listening to the church bells ring when the Japanese, called the Japs, Japanese surrendered. And the Japanese did in August and the Germans in April. And both times, all the people from town would gather in the churches and celebrate this. And of course, I grew up with an American flag next to the altar. And that's kind of not done anymore, which is probably wise. Cave Spring Baptist had a big controversy when the pastor moved the American flag out from the altar. What would you think of that? I think you probably don't put it close to the altar. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there's another king who reigns there.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But it was, that's kind of, in wartime, you got the danger, there is a danger of fusion. God's on our side, the devil's on their side. But I think you could support your country with great passion without fusing things. Well, then I talk about some current examples where in liberal Protestantism you get a lot of fusion. I like to talk about the ELCA, the church from which we came many years ago, where there's a complete accommodation to DIE, diversity, inclusivity, and equity, and the LGBT, or what Russ Torino calls the Rainbow Reich. By the leadership, not all the congregations, certainly not all the people in the LCA. College Lutheran down the road from us is relatively orthodox, and they wouldn't marry gays, but they're all fearful that the next convocation of the LCA, the provision for bound conscience is going to be gone. When 2009, when the ELCA made its decision to marry gays and to have gay pastors, I was part of the opposition, and we made sure at College Lutheran that we had bound conscience, that we could continue our beliefs. Actually, the pastor did too, and there was a special fund where we could put our money. But of course, that's all a little bit phony because the money can be used for various other purposes. So anyway, we knew that once the gates were opened, the flood would occur, and it really has. The ELCA has a team of lawyers who have proposed how the ELCA can be more comprehensively, intensively shaped by diversity, inclusivity, and equity. Now, how can a church build on that slogan, which has lots of elements in it that marginalize Orthodox Christianity? So anyway, Waltz, what's his, Tim Waltz, is going to be the first Lutheran who's going to be a vice president.
No, he's not.
Candidate, vice president, and he could be the first Lutheran vice president. So I looked a little bit into his history and what he believes and what he's done at Minnesota. And I looked into the parish in Minneapolis, St. Paul, that he belonged to. And then I looked at what the leadership of the ELCA is standing for. And I wrote an article for First Things in which I argued that the progressive Lutheran, Tim Waltz, is not the kind of Lutheran I would like to see as vice president. And I got a sharp rejoinder by a Lutheran author in a little journal called Forum Letter, where he criticizes me for identifying somebody with the church and criticizing for that. He goes through a long history of prejudice in America. Remember the prejudice against the Catholic being a president? I lived long enough ago that JFK said the most stupid things, that my faith will not make any difference to my work as president. Wow, that's a horrible thing for a Catholic to say, for a Christian to say. But he was so worried about being identified and mixed as a Catholic that he did that. So this article goes into that and claims that I'm being prejudiced against the ELCA, and his membership of the ELCA shouldn't make any difference. But my rejoinder was I wasn't criticizing the ELCA in general, I was criticizing its leadership, quoting the bishop, who is pro-choice, big time pro-choice, quoting the bishop, looking at the parish, which was very progressive. The staff had their preferred pronouns, and they didn't worship in the name of our Father. It was our mother, father, parent, and other ways that they were deeply into the LGBTQ. So I saw the confluence of all three of those things, and Waltz himself has the most radical abortion legislation in the country, and he stands for the LGBTQ Rainbow Reich, and DIE is in every level of the Minnesota government. So I was being more specific in what I thought the fusion was, and to be critical of that fusion. Well, that's too much on that, but one of the big fears now, the big agitations in the LCA, even in the Synod, Virginia Synod, is the worry about white Christian nationalism. This is a big target. Now, there are books coming out quickly about white Christian nationalism, and that's the big bugaboo of the cultural left, claiming that nationalism and conservative Christianity are fused, and they're even fused racially with white people. So who are these people? Where are they? Do you know any white Christian nationalists? Usually what they mean is just any conservative Christians, but they want to go a step further and claim a huge fusion in conservative Protestantism about white Christian nationalism. So I looked around a little on the internet, and there is a guy called Stephen Wolfe who wrote a book called The Case for Christian Nationalism. And he's a Reform scholar, and he thinks the United States ought to be shaped and run according to Reform Christian teachings, and Reform Christians ought to be in charge politically. And that we should be careful about what people we have in the country, because they should be kind of white and Protestant like us. So that kind of fusion, man, I certainly wouldn't buy into that at all. So that's one of their targets, I guess, but that's an extreme case. But I did run into something that was a little more disturbing, a little bit more compelling. Maybe those of you read the Wall Street Journal came across this article also. The title is "That Some Evangelicals Crusade for Trump." It's about a guy called Lance Wallnau. I don't think anybody probably in this group knows that or would admit to knowing, because he's part of the New Apostolic Reformation, a group that's holding revivals all over the country, in which the efforts of Donald Trump to become Christian are equated with Cyrus of God's redeeming work in America. And Kamala Harris and the Democrats are the work of Jezebel. She's a Jezebel and the leader of the demons that are attacking the good spirits of the Trump campaign. So this particular movement, and it shows the revival camps that he does, where he equates the Trump campaign and that Republican side of things with God's will and with redemptive energies, not just making the country better, but redemptive, killing the demons that are on the other side, because he's on the side of the angels, as it were. Well, I had not known anything about that, so there may be other examples of that kind of fusion, which are kind of embarrassing to Protestantism, I think, because it does certainly damage the radicality and universality of the gospel by locating redemptive activities of political work. That is really dangerous, because think of what happened in the 20th century, in which political movements claim redemptive capacities. The Nazis claimed to be the Third Reich, the third great civilization after Rome and Christendom. There would be the Nazi Reich, and it claimed redemption for Aryans. Came to subservience for all the rest of the people. Joanne and I, in our year at Fulbright, we had friends in Nuremberg, and they took us to the great plaza where the Nazis gathered, which is still there, and took us up to the podium where Hitler spoke, a very spooky kind of feeling. And they pointed out that over there was to be a zoo, and the zoo was not for animals. The zoo would be for examples of lesser inferior breeds that were part of the Nazi zoo that people would come. We'll talk about a fusion of race and politics and the Nazi movement. The same thing happened with the Bolsheviks, right? Claimed to be in a heaven on earth that were going to be reached by the Bolshevik Revolution. So those kinds of fusions were horrific. So we have in Protestant the kind of thing that we want to be careful of, as I think we're conservative Protestants, not only politically, but because theologically, but I'm guessing we're probably a dominance of political conservatives at Messiah Lutheran Church. My guess is
A little bit of a mix.
I won't take a vote, I won't,
Yeah.
I won't have, but I'd say probably we're on that, we're dominantly in that direction, and we have to be careful that we don't fuse our faith, the radicality of the gospel, with our church and with our political predispositions. I talk about an unusual happening in Catholicism, where we remember the pyramid diagram that I used is kind of coming back in Catholic intellectual life. There's a very famous guy called Patrick Deneen out of Notre Dame who wrote a book called The Failure of Liberalism. And it's called postmodernism, post-liberalism. There's a whole bunch of people, intellectuals, that believe that the liberal tradition that spawned America has died out because we no longer have virtue in the citizens. So that things are falling apart. And we have to have a religious revival in order to renew virtue of the citizenry. But liberalism itself has failed because it doesn't provide for the common good. It doesn't provide for virtue of the citizens. So he's very critical of the liberal. By the way, I don't think that's the liberal tradition that founded America. I think the founders knew we had to have virtue of the citizenry, so that's why they were all for religion. And the kind of enlightenment they were in part of was the Scottish Enlightenment, which was not hostile toward religion at all, not like the French Enlightenment was. So American tradition wasn't bare, spare liberalism. It had a mixture with the Judeo-Christian tradition from the very beginning. So I think Deneen's wrong about, he was at Roanoke College, gave his speech, and we had a good interaction because Roanoke College was founded to produce students of virtue. And Biddle, the founder, was he was called a Christian Republican, not the party, because he believed that the college was there to produce not only pastors and Christians, but citizens of virtue. It was part of the Second Great Enlightenment. So it wasn't the kind of bare, naked liberalism that Deneen laments, but that spawned a group of what are called integralists. Remember, the pyramid is all integrated? From the top down, from Catholic teachings on down, and from the Pope and the Catholic Church on down. There was a small group of people called integralists. One of them, by the name of Adrian Vermeule, at Harvard Law School, of all places. I was hoping our friend, the lawyer, would be here today.
He took one class from him.
I asked him whether he knew Adrian.
Yeah, he took one class with him.
He took some class
Yeah.
with him. I wonder what he thinks. Well,
He was a good teacher.
Vermeule probably was a specialist in some other area too. I don't know.
I don't know either.
But Vermeule calls for integralism again, by our country being shaped and guided by Catholic teachings, with Catholics at the top of the hierarchy and Catholic teachings. Now, how in the world is that going to happen? How in the world is white Christian nationalism going to have a reform regime? None of that seems to be the very unlikely possibility, impossible. But it hints that there's a temptation that seems to be in any serious religion of fusing with political life or cultural life. And I talk about the dangers of fusion again. And just end with a question for us as conservative Christians, Orthodox Christians. and properly conservative politically, what are some signals of ungodly fusion in our own midst? And what were some positive signals of resisting ungodly fusion in our own midst? Now, that's a fairly existential question, and I don't know if anybody wants to bite off on it. Well, I'd say first thing, you don't cancel out people on the other side, right? Secondly, you don't claim that they're non-Christian if they're going to vote differently than we're going to vote. I would have to outlaw a couple of my kids. And, you don't do that. We were canceled some years ago when a couple of friends found out that we voted for Trump in 2016, mainly because of the Supreme Court justices. And we were canceled right on the spot by one of our dear friends that we knew way back from 1960. We were at a restaurant in Washington. When she found out, I confessed to it, she got up at the table and walked out, and we hadn't seen her for years. She wouldn't correspond. And finally, her Christianity got the best of us, and she wrote us and apologized for canceling us. But that, we don't want to cancel. And you're going to do a prayer session, a session on politics and religion, and certainly that would be one of the things we don't want to do. Another thing I thought, to show that we're not fusing things, is have a little humility that we might be wrong. I mean, I'm a conservative politically, and I watch the rhetoric of the liberals politically, and they want to save democracy. Democracy is going to die if Trump wins. Well, I would say they should have a little humility. I don't think it's going to die. We should have a little humility as conservative politically. That I might be wrong about things. Trump may be dangerous, given a lot of his behavior. So we need to be humble on the one side and not canceling out people, putting them under the realm of the devil. Yeah, Michael.
Well, I think one of the things is to try to see where each side deviates from biblical principles, and where, no matter which side you're on, you're in difficult water with the secular solutions that the party applies to contemporary life and problems in society, so that you can, if your compassion is in the area of right to life, for example, you might find one party significantly more virtuous. But if your principal passion for caring for others is in welcoming the refugee and the homeless, you might be pulled radically to the other side and see that as a virtuous center. And so which thing are you going to be drawn to politically, and does it change how you think about that issue? Are you willing to compromise your own sense of propriety for your political aspiration?
Good. Well, next week we do the good way related to politics, which is what I call dialectical engagement, big fancy phrase. But I have a nice chart that will show how I think it ought to be done to avoid fusion and separation, and we'll work through that. And then the last two sessions before the election, we're going to take up the issues and how you might argue from the left on one issue, and how you argue from the right on one issue, so that by the time of the election, we should be able to see that we don't fuse things, but we might have good arguments one way or another. And then the session after the election, we'll talk about the fallout and what that means for Christians. Yeah,
Can I add one last thing to your last question?
sure, I'm tired.
I wanted to think about it. Imagine thinking before speaking. I wanted to think about it first, how to say it. First thing, there are Republicans, Independents, and Democrats who are all good members of our church. So maybe just start with that as a fact. The second is, because our ultimate allegiance is to Christ and his kingdom, we don't need our earthly politics to be redemptive. This is the main principle Bob's laid out here. Our friends who are secularists, they need their politics to be redemptive because it's all they got, right? I mean, it's, and you've probably experienced this in friendships or with kids or siblings where they've left the church and politics is all they have, and now they won't speak to you because this is an ultimate thing for them. Because it's not ultimate for us, we can actually kind of ease up a little, and we can say, you know what, the world isn't going to end if we lose. And that then opens up the space to be self-critical and say, okay, I'm going to vote for Trump, and these are the reasons why. Boom, 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 boom. But I saw the picture of him waving the pride flag at Mar-a-Lago. And I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen. Like I know that he does that. I don't need him to be better than that. Or I'm a Democrat and I'm going to vote for Kamala, and this is why. Boom, 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 boom. But I'm revolted by the pro-abortion, plank of the platform, and I'm not going to pretend that my party's perfect. That's the kind of just this worldly politics that our ultimate allegiance to Christ makes possible. And that's what makes possible for Christians to worship together who fall on different sides of the question. It's his class, Ken, so I gotta.
Last word.
I agree with you, Phil.
Yeah.
There's two comments I will make. One is, our politics shouldn't be redemptive. I agree with that. However, as Christians, we need to be redemptive. So we need to bring others to Christ. And where they are off track, I guess, we need to try to, through the Word and through Christ, bring them back. And so there's this gray area. And there's not a hard line on being a redemptive Christian, which I try to be, and working in the political arena and voting, which I try to do. So we all need to listen to God and do what He is telling us to do in our politics. The second thing is we shouldn't exaggerate. We shouldn't exaggerate one side or the other side. You talked about Trump waving the pride flag. Well, I looked that up. What he did wasn't waving the pride flag. He brought out a pride flag where a group of people that have that flag wrote on it, gays for Trump. And he was trying to indicate, in my opinion, that all people are supporting him. He wasn't waving the pride flag in pride for homosexuals. He was a politician trying to get a consensus of votes so that he could win as a politician, in my opinion. Okay? So we shouldn't exaggerate either side. I mean, the people who don't believe politically what I believe are good people that we should love, and I shouldn't be exaggerating what they're doing. It's the same way with Trump, and he gets exaggerated all the time. And he did that.
He exaggerates.
Well,
Okay.
sorry.
Last word.
We can leave the chairs where they are, because we're gonna have class in here, so we don't need to put them up.
Okay.